Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant, erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. And it's an honor and a privilege today to introduce you to Layla Feghali. Layla K. Feghali, MSW, was born to two immigrant Lebanese parents in Tongva territories, colonially known as the Los Angeles area. She has a background in community organizing and mental health, and is a continuing student of traditional healing, ancestral wisdom practices, and plantcestral medicine. Her work is dedicated to remembering the wisdom of our original ancestors, with a special emphasis on the revival and restoration of sacred ancestral practices from the Swana region where her own ancestors originate. And Swana, for those of you who don't know, stands for Southwest Asia and North Africa, and this is a less Eurocentric term for the incredibly diverse geographic area, more commonly referred to as the Middle East and North Africa. Her approach emphasizes relationship and strives to honor and re-centralize the wisdom alive in the body of the earth, in our own blood, bones, and hearts, to uncover, recover lost and taken ancestral knowledge for personal and collective healing and liberation from the deeply severing wounds of colonization across our earth. And she is currently based between her ancestral village in Lebanon and her diasporic home in the Tongva lands. And the interview is taking place with Layla in Lebanon. So you can learn more about her stories, her herbal medicines, her plantcestral remembrance classes, her embodied research project, and her other offerings at riverroseapothecary.com. It's riverroseapothecary.com. And you can also visit the online community archival project that she's hosting at swanaancestralmedicinehub.wordpress.com. And you can also follow her on Instagram and Facebook at riverroseapothecary. So it's just great to be able to have this chance to speak with you, Layla, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here.
Yeah, so let's just start with what is ancestral remembrance?
I'm sure different people have different ways they relate to what this means, but for me, ancestral remembrance is the journey and the process of working towards reconnecting to our ancestors and really to ourselves, to where we come from, to the relationships, the stories, the medicine, the resilience, the wisdom, and sometimes the wounds of our ancestors, of our predecessors. It's really, for me, kind of rooted in the kind of understanding that because of the impacts of colonialism and war and exile and just migration, of all kinds, that a lot of us have been kind of removed or stripped from, our original traditions, our original wisdom, our original practices, and, to varying degrees. Some of us have a closer relationship than others. But I think that I've really felt the kind of displacement internally, and sort of just, wanted to reconnect more, more closely to my roots as a source of resilience. And when I realized that my family, because of all those traumas and all those things, often either didn't know the answer to things that I was curious about, or really just had a hard time talking about them, I kind of lean into the understanding and the wisdom that, we really are our ancestors, that, they're in our blood and in our bones, quite literally. And so ancestral remembrance is kind of the connection, the process of really tapping into, our own our own embodied memory, to recall and kind of just mend those relationships. And I think of it as really a process, of relationship healing, not just, with our ancestors, but I think with all the processes and the energies in our natural world and in ourselves that are really required to tap into that. So a lot of like decolonizing the way that you know things and the way that you collect knowledge. And I'm not sure if that quite makes sense, but it feels very much like a process to me. And I like to call it remembrance with a hyphen, because I think it is a returning to who we are, like a returning home, like a remembrance, but it's also a collecting of the dismembered pieces, and kind of like a bringing back together, a healing of things that have been scattered.
Thinking of a time several years ago, I had this really persistent cough that just wouldn't leave. And, after trying all the things, and I had this moment of like, I was sitting and I had this like feeling of, those old Rolodexes that people used to have, where it was like that, but in my brain, and it was like mullein. And I was like, all right, mullein. Like I'm not an herbalist. I'm not an herb person. And so I was just like, all right. And I went and got mullein and used it, and it took away the cough. And found out later that was a plant that had grown where my ancestors lived. And it felt like that. And I think that's what you're talking about like that there is access in our own bodies to information that our ancestors, how they practiced, how they prayed, how they did ritual, how they lived their lives, how they healed, like all the things that they had to, like that survival memory is encoded into our bodies, and we can tap into that, especially if there's a sense of displacement or disbelonging that we feel. Am I getting it?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. That's such a beautiful story. And it's funny because when you were talking and you were like, I had a cough, the herbalist in me was like, oh, mullein, for some reason before you even said that. So I was like, oh, okay. I was,
that's
feeling
great.
that.
That's great. Our ancestors were playing together.
Yeah, hanging out.
They're like, let's mess with them now.
So sweet.
Yeah, I'd love to hear like a story about I know you're a storyteller. So like how or when is a time that you've experienced this ancestral remembrance?
Well, I'm actually called right now to just if it's okay to tell a couple stories. One is just that something that I realized, kind of without thinking about it intentionally, but I really realized that the stories of my ancestors actually speak a lot about remembrance. And so I want to just honor that in terms of our creation stories and our cosmologies. Two particular stories come to mind, and I won't tell the whole thing because we'll be here till tomorrow. But there are two deities, that or energies that are embodied in both the Sumerian and the Egyptian traditions that I realized some point upon my path and along my searching that this whole story about needing to kind of go back to your ancestors to find something about yourself, or to have to, put things back together again, is something that I really associate with first the story of Inanna, who goes into the underworld. Inanna is a deity in the Sumerian pantheon who, goes down into the underworld to visit her sister. And the story talks a lot about her journeys through the gates of the underworld. And at each gate, she sheds something of herself, starting with the more superficial parts of herself and going into deeper parts, like her clothes and her sacred items and her jewelry, and to the point where she's basically a lump of raw meat on a wall in the underworld. And the whole story is about her journey through the underworld and also her resurrection, which happens, 3 days later, after her, loyal sister realizes that she hasn't come back and starts drumming and basically praying and petitioning to the gods to bring her back. And when she manages to actually, receive their favor and she comes back, there's a condition because people can't go to the underworld and come back. And so she has to send someone in her place. And she comes back, and after this really difficult journey, through the depths, through the underworld, which I, associate very much with the ancestors, as well as other things like, the underworld of our own grief, our own pain, our own losses, our own, just darkness. And I don't say that with a negative connotation, but really just those deep places inside of us where, we're really just faced with ourselves, and we also face the things that weigh us down or that cause us pain, and just shedding herself. And when she comes back, she takes an inventory of her life and the people in her life, and she sees that her lover, he didn't mourn her. He just kind of went on his merry way and was just chilling and doing his thing and maybe enjoying the power that he had in her absence. And so she basically determined that he was the one who would have to share that time in the underworld, and would be there for 6 months out of the year. And that was how she restored balance to those relationships and that experience. And so, we can understand this as wisdom embodying the seasons and the way that the cycle of life happens in our natural world. But I think that in the story, there's so much there that reminds me of this process of remembering. And really, it's the dismembering. It's like she had to dismember before she could remember. And the remembering was really about a lot more than her personal journey, but it was really about the restoration of balance in our universe, in our relationships, in our lives. And so I want to just honor that story. And the other story that, I didn't really realize the relationship of these stories, particularly this next one I'm going to tell, to my own journey in a way that gave me meaning until, I don't know, probably just a couple of years ago or something. And I've been on this path for at least 12 years. So the other story is the story about Isis and Osiris. And some of your listeners are probably familiar with this story. Both of these stories are pretty, well known as far as cosmology stories go. Also because I think that our particular region has had our deities and our stories quite appropriated, quite frankly. But anyways, I digress. So just to say, so Isis and Osiris, the story that comes to mind is a story where they were put into exile by their very jealous and kind of power-hungry brother, who killed Osiris and sent his coffin up the Nile. And Isis, his wife, went into exile and hiding after that because she had to escape. And she went searching for his coffin so that she could honor him and also make medicine over him to eventually resurrect him. But she just traveled up the Nile in hiding, and she actually traveled all the way up the Nile into the Mediterranean Sea and basically ended up in Byblos, they say, which is right here on the coast of Lebanon, just about 10, 15 minutes drive away from where I am located right now. And she, found that Osiris's coffin had basically brushed up on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea on the coast of Byblos, and it had become entrenched in a tree. And the local king of that area saw this tree one day and said, wow, this is a really powerful, beautiful tree. And he said, I'm going to take this to make it a sacred pillar in my shrine, in my, castle, wherever it was. And so he took the tree and he made it a sacred pillar in his home. And so Isis didn't want to reveal to people that she was Isis, that she was the queen. And so she made herself very humble and found a strategy using her medicine and her plants and her herbs and the beautiful aromas by which she would kind of earn the favor of the women who washed their clothes every day at the water. And so she caught their attention one day and basically found her way into the castle, where she ended up being the nurse. She was basically breastfeeding the son of the king in the castle and, doing her thing. And I'm really going to edit some parts of the story right now, or abbreviate rather, not edit. But things happened, and eventually it was revealed that she was the queen. And the king said, oh, okay, of course you can have the coffin back. Take the coffin and go do what you need to do. And so she took the coffin and she got in her boat. And right when she got in the boat, their brother found out and basically sent his powers or his people to come, and they scattered the bones of Osiris all through the water. And Isis basically after that had to go on a journey of collecting the bones one by one, because she needed his bones to be together in order for her to, breathe life back into him again. And so the story, goes on. And for me, it was really powerful to just realize, especially that, these both Inanna and Isis really are kind of embodiments of the feminine in a really particular way. And it was really powerful for me to realize that, I really think of our cosmologies and have been taught to understand our cosmologies as, not just mythical stories, but really like instructions about life and really of the most precious medicine that our ancestors left us to share about their relationship with the natural places we're from, and a lot of understandings about just how to be a human and how to be a soul, and how to negotiate this journey. And so for me, these two stories, when I really realized that, wow, for all the grief that I think I know others feel sometimes about what's been lost and stripped, I'm aware that our ancestors spoke about this, and that they also, it's like they knew, and they also left hope, and they left some kind of medicine for us to know how to come through the other side. So I really think about the times that I have felt like Inanna in the underworld, really being with the grief and kind of needing to shed and let go and be dismembered. And then times where I feel like Isis collecting the bones, literally the bones. I don't know what more explicit, metaphor for the ancestors there could be, but really just gathering the bones, all the scattered parts of myself, of my ancestors, to be able to breathe new life. And in the story, when she does collect his bones, there's one bone missing, but the crocodiles or the alligators, I think it's crocodiles actually, that were in the Nile as she traveled back down, and in the waters, they were allies to her. So they didn't eat the other bones. And she had so much help and so much alliance from the spiritual and the natural world, all through the story. And she was able to breathe life back into Osiris, and to create new life too, even despite the fact that, one piece couldn't be repaired. So those stories just came up to me right now as you asked for stories. And I think for my own personal stories, I think because this work is so much a process and a journey, I really experience it to be, it's a little hard to tell like a clear, just explicit story like that, because I'm still living my life. So the stories of ancestral remembrance are constantly unfolding, like they're living with me. But one story that I'll share is I facilitate, what my main offering these days has been something that I call Swana plantcestral remembrance spaces or circles. And they're basically series of these small intimate circles that I facilitate with Swana community members, mostly from the diaspora. And we build relationships with our ancestral plants, kind of as agents of memory and consciousness for this ancestral remembrance work. And we work with more than just the plants. We do a lot of dream work in the classes, and we do some cosmology work and some different things. And I think in our first round of the class, we did a dream incubation, and I received a really powerful dream that felt like a remembrance to me, but I couldn't really quite understand all the pieces. And in the dream, what happened was I went to visit a house where there was a beautiful meal being served, and the people who were hosting this meal were there. And after a little while, my parents walked in, and they had a gift in their hand that was for these people who felt like they were either really close family friends or distant family members, but there was some kind of close relationship with them. And my mother and my father went up to them, and my mother had something in her hands that she was going to present to the family. And she presented it to them, and what it was a key. And what came to be understood was that this key was a key to olive groves that somehow, this was all implied in the dream, but that somehow had belonged to this family, and had been somehow taken away from them or removed from them. And somehow my mother and my father got it back somehow and returned it to them. And there was a lot of just generosity and humility and celebration in that act. And it felt really important and special and beautiful. And I didn't really understand what the story was about, but it felt like a remembrance in and of itself for that to have been restored, especially because olive trees, for us, they're like trees of life for us. They're deeply, deeply connected to our ancestors and our ability to sustain our lives. They're probably the most singularly most common and important plant that we have relied on through this part of the region. And then 2 years later, I was facilitating another circle, completely separate circle with completely different group of people. I think there was only one person or two people maybe in the class who overlapped. And one of the members of the class was a friend of mine who was also a distant cousin of mine, related to me on my maternal side. And we were working with a plant from this region. We were working with sage and a local sage. And it was the first plant we were working on. And she kept saying, I have this, great grandmother who keeps coming up for me through working with this plant. And I don't know why. I actually know nothing about this grandmother. And she just was going on her journey and started doing interviews with her grandmother, who is my paternal grandfather's first cousin. And she would ask her and stay, we were just holding space for her as she continued to do that process. And on our last day of working with that particular plant, I think we were kind of getting ready to close out. And she just said at the very end, she said, there's something about this story about my great grandmother that there was just something about it that needed to be told. And she just said, I was told a story about my great grandmother who had olive groves that were hers in the village that somehow, people kind of tricked her or didn't honor that they were hers, or I'm not sure what the exact details are about how this happened, but the story was that they got taken away from her. They got swindled from her. And I just stopped. Because she wasn't there for my initial dream. But the other person who was in both of those particular cycles, working with different plants, remembered that dream too with me. And we started to kind of piece together the way that, our ancestors and our plantcestors, our ancestral plants really speak through us and wake up. And so it was a remembrance that we are continuing to engage in and to this day, about why did the ancestors bring up that story through us? Why did that need to be revealed? What of the dream I had already kind of retributed her grandmother, and what of her grief that was still there came up to be addressed between us who share that lineage? And so it was really powerful and really beautiful.
For all of those stories, really, and just wanting to offer a supplication to Inanna and to Isis, of course. And Layla, I don't think I would be doing my job very well if I didn't say what I bet a lot of people are thinking as they're listening to this. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Which is like, your parents handed your ancestors the key. And I'm thinking, oh, what might Layla's mom be holding? And I'm thinking, what's the key? I'm thinking, oh, well, duh, it's Layla.
Thank you.
Right? In that way that like unlocking these stories, right? Unlocking these remembrances is how justice happens. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's how transgenerational healing happens. Like, we are the key to healing our ancestors, the things that remained undone in their lives, right?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's really I think that in the context of being a person from this part of the region, it holds so many layers And thank you for saying that. That honors me very much. And, I'm doing my best, to be a part of that, that return. But, here, both olive trees and keys are very much tied up with Palestine and with, the colonization and the continued occupation of Palestine. And, there's a lot of our current cosmologies and stories that really are involved with the way that our elders carry keys to homes that they're determined to return to. And I'm not just talking about physical homes, I'm talking about the relationship to place. And, even if the homes have been demolished or whatever it is. So it is very much tied in with this justice, and many different layers, deep layers. So thank you for offering that.
One of the things that's really cool about doing the podcast is that I get to see my blind spots. I get to see the stuff that I don't know about. And when I was preparing for this interview and I was reading through your blog and your project, because I'm going to ask you about it, the Homeward Healing Trip. And you talked about going to Palestine on your American passport and like what it was like to be able to go to Palestine and kind of all that meant. And I was really struck by it because I didn't realize that folks from Lebanon couldn't go to Palestine. Like it's just a blind spot that I have. And I just want to, if there's anything there that wants to come through about that, about like both your experience, because I know that you want to really speak from that place of rawness and truth of your own experiences of like what that was. And I do want to get into more of like the Homeward Healing Trip later, but just like, since we're here at Palestine, is there anything that needs to come through here?
Yeah, thank you. My homeward healing trip on terms of passports and Palestine was actually really interesting. Yeah, Lebanese are not allowed to go to Palestine, and there's a lot there. But because I have a U.S. passport, I kind of I managed my way with the blessings of the ancestors. Undoubtedly, as many U.S. born Arabs are also, rejected at the borders. But in the case of Lebanon and Syria, we're not allowed to go there either because Lebanon and Syria as states do not recognize the legitimacy of Israel. And so it is our small way of kind of refuting the legitimacy of settler occupation. And there's a lot of, layers around the choice to go also politically. But for me, and I don't know how smart it is for me to be talking about this on the radio, but I have two passports. I have a Lebanese passport and a US passport. So I'm very privileged, very, very deeply privileged. And there's no way that I could have done my journeys if not, because there's no way I could have gone to Iran and Palestine and all the other places I went in the same breath, if not. But, being in Palestine for me was really, it was really about, and that passport experience and the crossing of borders was really deeply, I feel like the most simple way for me to say it is that it's about as ancestral as it gets. Like just 2 generations ago, we didn't have any of these borders. My grandparents used to go to Palestine on a daily, weekly basis. Palestine, Jerusalem is closer to Beirut than, Oakland is to Los Angeles. Okay, like Oakland to Los Angeles could get me to Egypt. Just for perspective about this region and why there's so much exchange ancestrally between our region, our people, we moved. I don't mean that we didn't have home bases. I mean, these borders didn't exist. So for me, it felt like surpassing like the falsity of these borders in order to connect in the flesh and with my heart to like my brothers and sisters and other folks, all my folks in Palestine, and to really be able to have those conversations together in spite of these borders and the ways that they're militarized and politicized. And that was really powerful, not just for me, but I felt that it was very powerful for the Palestinians that I interacted with, many of whom would say things to me like, oh my God, like, we know everything about you. Like, we know everything about Lebanon, and we think about you guys all the time, and we feel so close to you and whatever. And then some of them would say, you're the first Lebanese I've ever met in my life, you know? And it was just really, really powerful. It was like family returning home after being separated. And I'm not talking about all the really complex politics in between, which includes the fact that, you know, Palestinians live in Lebanon in horrible conditions. And I was actually really surprised about how generous people were, because, you know, the relationships between us are really complex and layered. And, you know, like everybody, we, you know, family has its struggles, like family has its feuds, you know, and its battles. But I think that it was all about love for me, and the, you know, the actual experience of crossing the borders and having the passport was, I really believe, was just completely the blessing of my ancestors who guided me to go there. It was unfathomably smooth, and most of my friends in Palestine told me that they thought it was kind of like an anomaly how smooth it was, considering the fact that I went in that way and that I had a Lebanese stamp in my American passport and still managed to get in with minimal, you know, violence and interrogation.
I mean, I'm curious what like minimal, like you don't have to go into it, but I'm just like, oh, minimal.
Well, minimal.
That means there's still like, there's still like, it's still rough, right? It's not like woohoo, like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you really simply, like minimal means that they didn't, you know, they didn't really interrogate me very much. And beyond like waiting for what seems like an unnecessary amount of time alongside all the other Arabs, both diaspora and local, you know, that I really didn't get bothered much. And I really didn't even wait as long as most people do.
Yeah, I'm so delighted with the this, because I think, like, you know, here, if I go to Canada and I have a trouble at the border, I'm like, what, yeah, and I mean, I know a lot of like, you know, white North Americans feel that way, like, oh my gosh, I had to answer questions, you know, it's like they asked me where I was going.
Right. Yeah, like try being an Arab anywhere. Like anywhere, including in your own, like, you know, in your own ancestral lands. Yeah, it's very.
Yeah. I just want to like dig in a little bit. Like, what's it like to live in your ancestral village?
Oh, that's a fun question. You know, I've been very fortunate. You know, my ancestors really hooked me up. Like they really set me up to be able to do this, and I'm eternally grateful. But you know, my parents are both immigrants, and so. And my father's family lived here through. I mean, they basically all live here, except for one of his brother's families also migrated. So they had stayed here. They were here through the war. They were here through the war. Let me just give context to that because I don't know how much folks know. But there was a long civil war in Lebanon through most of my childhood, which is actually what caused me and my family to settle in the U.S. Not that they were fleeing war, but that they couldn't return because the war kind of wouldn't let up. So my father was never really planning on living in the U.S. He was had gone for schooling when things on the war here really picked up, and he wanted to complete his education in a place that was a little bit more able to hold him. So my grandmother sent him off, and he just thought that he would come back, but the war just kept on going and going and going. So he ended up staying there. So all to say that I have a lot of immediate family here. My mother's family are more diaspora. They are more scattered throughout the diaspora. They're her immediate family. But my father's village, my grandmother was still living here until she made her transition a few years ago. And so because my curiosity and my kind of longing to connect started pretty young, basically, as soon as I became old enough to travel on my own, I started coming here pretty regularly. Like I would come in summers through college. I would come in summers through college to stay with my grandmother and to live in the village house with her. And after college, I moved and I got my own space in the city, and I lived there for, or actually, that's a long story, but I basically have been coming and going for the past over a decade, like almost the past 2 decades of my life. So coming here started to feel a little more seamless in terms of it's kind of normal, for me to come and go here. It's become normal. And so living in my dad's village has become, it's just one of my homes. And it's been really beautiful at times. And if I can just say, as I'm sure that you and anyone who has gone to ancestral lands can relate to, it's pretty intense sometimes. And Lebanon has a very particular energy. I don't think it's a coincidence that Isis had the remembering part of her journey, the like putting back together of the bones and the reclaiming what was lost. I don't think it's a coincidence that happened in Lebanon, that it's like the one story that's really about her being in Lebanon. I think Lebanon has a very particular energy of, I want to say it's kind of obsidian. It's kind of scorpionic. It's very, all those things that you kind of try. It's very plutonic. It's all those things you kind of try to look away from are just right there on the surface here. I think anyone who's even visited Lebanon will probably tell you that. And anyone who knows anything about the history or the contemporary reality of Lebanon and just all the complexities and just contrasting things that exist here will probably be able to pick up on that. And so doing ancestral work here and being here for periods of time has been very blessed. And it's also just asked me to do a lot of healing. And a lot of the times, my certain cycles here are really about unaddressed things in my body or my mind or my spirit coming up to be worked on, especially because even though I have extended family here, I also, I'm more isolated because I live in a village. I don't have that many peers. My family members are starting to become older, and I'm more settled here as a local kind of thing. So I'm not necessarily constantly interacting with people in this way that you do when you're a visitor. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Well, I think it does. It's great because it's like, I have this like romantic vision of that, right? And so it's really good to hear. Yeah. And it's like, it's beautiful and it's fucking hard sometimes. And like, it's complex and like, it's great. And, all the layers of it, which of course, right. It just helps to make it more like human.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Plus, I think just being diaspora brings that because it's hard to be between homelands. Like once you're from a place in whatever kind of way, you're just always like, there's parts of me that are always in California and parts of me that are always here and parts of me that are always in these various places that I build relationships to. So talk about fragmented and remembering and kind of like finding your own wholeness within, being somewhere. It's a really interesting path.
Yeah, I want to talk with you about the plantcestors, and I want to read something that you wrote, and then I want to talk with you about roses, okay? Because I think that
right
ties
on
in with the great ancestral village stuff. So you said, this is what you wrote. You said, besides cultural value and memory, that you're talking about plants, ancestral plants carry the genetic composition of our lands and connect us to it literally. Just like how our own blood connects us to our ancestors, even if there are so many generations back, we never had the chance to meet them. We are our ancestors, and these plantcestors are our ancestral land and carry its wisdom and medicine in deeper ways than we may even consciously acknowledge so much of the time. This is not true just in a spiritual woo-woo kind of way, but in our bodies. They are our ancestors. Like I always say, their bodies, their medicine, their food source literally has informed the composition of who we are and who our ancestors were, and they are made of the minerals and body of our homelands, which makes them so specific. So yeah, let's talk about that. And in particular, I want to talk about roses just because, like, I know you have a deep connection with them, ancestral connection. I also do. And that was part of what brought us together in terms of doing this interview. So would you just talk a little bit about Rose as your personal plantcestor and what you've learned and just the ways that you engage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that quote just says the plantcestry thing in general, but I will say that, for me, just for context for folks, plantcestors is a word that I came up with, as far as I know, perhaps not, but that really just embodies that wisdom, but that wisdom really is ancestor. I mean, parts of that wisdom, at least, the understanding of plants as ancestors are, it's, something that indigenous folks all over the world regard and understand. And gosh, even science can probably get down with that. But so I rely on, I've started, because I realized that there was a lot of wisdom and memory that I wasn't going to be able to access through just like finding someone or asking someone. Even like a really old person who knows things has fragmented knowledge here. Oftentimes I actually got called to working with the plants. They started telling me in my dreams to work with plants and to learn about plants and who to learn from and all these kinds of things. And I realized later that it was really about the fact that plants could be allies to kind of open up those memories because of all the things that you just read from that quote, which is that like they carry memory too, and they can talk to us through our bodies and through our spirits in such deep, profound ways, as my story with the key and the grandmother, really demonstrates. But roses are, for me, like roses really are about my grandmothers. Both my great grandmother on my paternal grandmother's side and my maternal grandmother's side are named Rose. One is Warde, which means rose in Arabic, and one is Rose. And I know that this is kind of cliche, but like, aren't roses like the quintessential grandma plant? Like worldwide, I feel like they are the quintessential grandma plant. Like I feel like I've been taught about roses by people who love them, by grandmas, like by Mayan grandmas and Mexican grandmas and Syrian grandmas and Armenian grandmas and Iranian grandmas and like basically any grandma you can talk to. Like roses are just really beloved grandmother plants. And for me, when I was trying to connect to like the essence that I wanted to hold my practice, one day I just, like Rose just came up and was like, hello, duh. Like it's me, because Rose is connected to my female ancestral lineages. And I feel like roses are, again, this is kind of cliche, but they're just love, And I mean that not in a flat way. I mean that like what roses have been for me are like love in all of its complexity and its layers and its nuances. And I feel like rose gets flattened a lot, but for me, rose is like this beautiful, vulnerable, soft, point pokey, resilient, just layered, you know, being that just unfolds at its own time, in its own way, with its own wisdom, and really is just like whole upon itself, but is also just like, it's like a softening force in my life that also is resilient and strong and just connected to just like lineages and lineages and lineages of grandmothers, who who know how to tend life. Really.
Ah, yeah. Way to bring it home, Layla.
Thank you.
Know how to tend life.
I mean,
yeah.
That's like
everything you're saying is
right. Yeah. That's like really what we're trying to do here, right? So
yes, is tend life. Thank you. Thank you. And I think, just also of like the generosity, right? Like that's something that I've learned from Rose of just like the generosity of like, I am beautiful and I offer this like beautiful fragrance, like just because I do, because I want to,
Yeah.
It's like my purpose. I want to just have a moment. We've covered such rich territory, I feel like, today. And I feel like we didn't get so much into the homeward healing trip, but we did touch on it. But I want to just offer a moment of a ritual moment, really, where for you to just really drop in with your plantcestors, with your ancestors, with, the land base, and just see if there's anything that needs to come through here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Geez, I kind of feel like Rose just brought that transition in with the life tending piece, actually. What I'm feeling is just that, I feel like what needs to be spoken is just that the kind of call to remember our ancestors is really so deeply rooted in just like this global, universal, like multiversal, urgency right now to really restore the life affirming wisdom about how to live and how to be as earthly beings. And I really believe, like, through my own seeking and healing and just trying to understand and unravel my own trauma, but also my pain about like the way that our world sometimes is in the modern context. I feel like where my ancestors have guided me is to an understanding that it's really more than just about finding personal home. It's really about, restoring the incredibly nuanced, beautiful, relational, and place-based universal wisdom and medicine and resilience that our original ancestors have had to know how to live in life-affirming ways. And, it's really that's like really what this work is about returning to. And for me, that is the dignity and justice that we can talk about from, a political or social or mental place too, but really just going deep into the sacred places that are so, deeply indigenous. And I mean that not as like indigenous to a certain place, but like indigenous as in like connected to our specific places on the earth, like through relationship with the earth, and with life itself. So I think that's what's coming to me, is just about life affirming wisdom rooted in like the mysteries of creation, and how to negotiate and tend that in a way that brings dignity and reverence to like all the living beings of our world, and allows us to live in alignment with purpose and with beauty and with love and with wisdom through the challenges in between.
Layla Feghali, I am offering roses at your grandmother's feet.
Thank you so much. We didn't get to talk about where your connection to roses are, though.
It shall remain a mystery.
To be continued.
Grandma's, of course, it's grandma's. See,
I was right.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks so much for being on the show. And I just really, if you do this homeward healing trip that we didn't get to touch on, you have written extensively about. And I really want to suggest to folks, if you have any interest in doing this work that Layla is suggesting, that you can read her work on her website, which is again Swana Ancestral Medicine Hub.wordpress.com. And so it's SWANA, Swana, complete word, Ancestral Medicine Hub, right? Swana Ancestral Medicine Hub at .wordpress.com. Mm-hmm. And your personal website is riverroseapothecary.com, which I'm sure that folks can get to the other one as well. There's information there about the homeward healing trip, and wanting to direct folks to your offerings and to your classes and teachings, and just like you as a source of goodness and tending of life on the planet right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pavini. Thank you so much for holding this space and for welcoming me.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure. And I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. And if you feel inspired by what you heard here, why don't you also check out my website, which is Transcestral Healing, which I think is really cute. Transcestral, yeah. Ancestralhealing.com. And you can learn more about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer. And also, I just really like hearing from folks about how the show is landing. So if like any of your ancestors got lit up by this, about hearing about the roses, and are like, hey, I want to say something, like really reach out, be in touch. There's a contact form there you can use. You can also go to the bespokenbones.com website, contact me through that. Just love to hear your suggestions and thoughts for the show. And I am Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.